Welcome to today's video. I'm Dave Keating from the Gulfstream Blues Substack, and I'm joined by
Julian Howes from the French Dispatch. We're here to talk to you about all of the messy situations happening over the last couple of days.
Exactly. We haven't done one of these in a while, so we're happy to be doing it.
For
This
sure.
one's not live, it's recorded. Substack's come out with this new recording studio thing, so we're trying it out. We'll see if we like it better than the lives. The one thing is then we can't take questions from you guys as we're doing it, but maybe we can do this sometimes and sometimes do the lives, play around with the different technology that's on offer. Julian, I wanted to ask you about, we're going to be talking about the big thing that everyone's talking about right now, which is the Iran war, and the question on the table this week, which is whether the Europeans should bail Trump out of the disaster that he has created with this war by sending warships over to the Strait of Hormuz, as he's asking. We'll get to that in a bit, but I'm really curious to get the French take on this, because obviously France is really the only significant military power in the European Union. So France's decision on this will be really pivotal. And I think I've detected some mixed signaling on this question. Even though it's been a firm no, then they seem to be saying other things that suggest it might not be. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask you about the first round of these local elections that happened in Paris and Marseille yesterday. This is the first round. The second round will be Sunday. What happened in those elections? And I'm curious what this signals about the political direction in France.
Oh, for those who don't know, yesterday we had around 3,500 municipal elections taking place across France for mayors, for local leaders, and this kind of position here. With one of the big events being the election for the Paris mayoralty, which is usually one of the positions that is most prominent and is often seen as a guide towards the Elysee eventually, and has been historically for many candidates. It didn't really work for Hidalgo, but it works usually for Chirac and other leaders there. Now, yesterday, with these 3,500 elections, we saw a small snapshot of how the country really is viewing politics today, with the caveat that usually the oldest parties tend to perform the best in general. So we're talking the Parti Socialiste usually does very well, Les Républicains usually do quite well, and the newer parties like Renaissance or Place Publique or what have you will usually typically not perform as well. But there were a couple of surprises. First of all, everybody was expecting the far right to come out swinging and really have a massive wave. Hasn't really materialized in the 2,400-ish seats that have already been called and the elections have been won by candidates. Yesterday, out of this 2,400 or so, only about 50, maybe max far-right seats, victories were found in the seats. However, the far left overperformed quite a bit, and they were expected to fail due to the ongoing crisis around Jean-Luc Mélenchon and his bizarre positions and the behavior he takes. And on top of that, the centrist bloc seems to be having middling results, with Macron's party and Macron's allies typically not performing too well, but the indications being that the centrists are getting around 400, 500 seats total just from yesterday's results. But there's around 1,000 seats to go still. And with the second runoff coming up soon, what's really going to be interesting is how these electoral dynamics play out and what alliances are formed. For example, the center-left doesn't really want to work too closely with the far-left because they view Mélenchon not only as a toxic poison for their electorability, toxic person in general. I don't like that guy. Many people don't like that guy. But the problem is that in many seats, he has done very well. His party has done very well, sorry. His allies in the other parties have done semi-well as well. And so we're seeing some places like in Strasbourg where an ecologist, or in some of the western districts with the PS, who are closer to Mélenchon, actively creating these alliances with him. And on the other side, what will Les Républicains do in terms of elections that it can win with the help of the far right? One of the big questions is, for example, in Paris, Rachida Dati is behind the socialists by about 14%, I believe it was. And she can pick up a lot of the votes from the far right. But in doing so, then you end up bringing in the calculation. Will the center then still support candidates like Dati who pull out, and vice versa on the left? So it's becoming a very interesting and a very messy snapshot of what's going on.
I mean, I think in Brussels, a lot of people are wondering. Macron has been so hobbled since he called that snap election in 2024 and lost control of the parliament. And his ambitions have really had to be grounded since then, right? On the international stage. It's really hurt his political capital here in the European Council. So I think that people are looking at the results in France and trying to extract, okay, how is Macron's health after this? And I think that the other thing that they're watching, I'm certainly watching, is the performance of the center left, because we know after President Hollande, the center left in France was really decimated and had a long way to go to come back. And the center left really across Europe has been decimated. Only 3 countries right now have center left leaders. That's Malta, Spain, and Denmark. Denmark with Mette Frederiksen, I'm not even sure you can call her left, but Pedro Sanchez has really been the last man standing. And he's suddenly seen his profile majorly boosted by his opposition to the Iran war. And I'm seeing the center left Socialists and Democrats group really running with that, right? They're using a lot of clips, not only from Sanchez, but also from other government officials in Spain, lambasting the PP, the EPP member in Spain, the Partido Popular, for their support of Trump, for their closeness with Trump. And I'm wondering if opposition to the Iran war is going to be able to give the center left a boost across Europe, because the center right, because conservatives across Europe have embraced Trump, were initially defending this war, as President von der Leyen and Chancellor Merz did, and Prime Minister Maloney. And now that's really turning into a liability for them. So I'm wondering, the performance that you were mentioning from the center left yesterday, do you think that's a harbinger of the center left getting back on its feet in France? And maybe could that be a preview of things to come across Europe?
I've been covering this for I think the last 2 years now. We've really seen a sort of remontada from the center left in France, where they're progressively taking more and more space on the international stage. And for a while, they were very much hiding behind the far left. So they didn't really feel they had much power. They didn't feel they could really impose themselves internationally, because typically what would happen is Olivier Faure, the first secretary of the socialists in France, would come out of a comment and then immediately be slapped down by the far left. Immediately hounded down, told he doesn't know what he's talking about, be quiet, know your place, blah, blah, blah. Since the elections where Macron called one of the dumbest political plays I've ever seen in my life, and gave the opportunity to the Parti Socialiste a really strong position in the left wing with a lot more power, a lot more strength, and a lot more ability to negotiate with the other parties, they've been a lot more forceful, and they're being much more forceful in general. And you see this through the fact that Jérôme Gage is a prominent voice now in French politics again, after having been a bit in the wilderness. Raphael Glucksmann tends to take a lot more of a stronger position. And you see that the other people on the left tend to listen more towards the PS than the La France Insoumise. The problem, however, and this comes back to Macron's health in general, and I think in general the health of the elections coming up, is that the municipal elections are very much local. There's a lot of people voting through the candidates they know best from their area in the first round. And the ones who don't go through the first rounds are either Paris or the big metropoles or whatever. National elections are very different, because typically people are voting for different things. So we saw with the presidential elections, quite often it comes down to counter voting and voting blocks to keep out certain candidates. So, for example, the far right, people typically try to clan together and vote against the far right in the second round. Also the far left in theory, but the problem is we're looking at a potential far left, far right second round presidential election, which I'm not even sure who I'm going to vote for in that situation. And in the legislative elections, it's also a similar situation to the local elections. However, because they have more power, because they have power of the national economy, education policy, health policy, foreign policy, what have you, people tend to be a bit more aggressive when it comes to those campaigns. Even here in Brussels for the Français de l'étranger, for example. So while I would love to say that what we're seeing now with the pairs being stronger than they have been historically in recent major elections, the reality is that in general, we can't really say yet for sure, because all it takes is another François Fillon blowing up his election, or Olivier Faure screwing something up during the primaries, or Glucksmann being fired from his position because he did something wrong, or Mélenchon pushing harder and the militants really aggressively going for the PS. We don't know what's going to happen. What we do know is that the probability is whoever can come in second place against the RN in the presidential elections is going to be the one who probably ends up winning that presidential election at this stage.
So when we're looking at Macron's strength, I mean, so I'm thinking in this current situation this week. So we have this meeting of foreign ministers that's just wrapped up here in Brussels, where they did not take any decision on sending military support to the Strait of Hormuz. Obviously, they were talking about how Europe should respond to the Iran war, but as expected, they didn't really come out with anything tonight. We have this European Council summit happening on Thursday of the national leaders. Europe's reaction to the Iran war will come up, but this idea of sending ships, maybe it comes up to do it in some kind of coordinated EU way at that council summit. I doubt that will reach any agreement on that. But as Macron walks into that summit, in my opinion, he's been really sidelined in the council over the past year, that the council has really been run by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and Macron just keeps getting shunted further and further off to the side. How does this war impact him politically, do you think, on the European stage? How is his position domestically? Is it getting any better that he can come into these council summits with a little more capital? And what do you think will be his decision in the end on whether to bail Trump out here and send ships to the Strait of Hormuz?
So I think the problem is that at this stage in his mandate, I don't think that the polling or the domestic situation really has much of an impact on Macron's power in the council anymore. I think we got into the stage now, Macron's out next year. And I think in general, the rest of the council leaders, they used it as an excuse to sideline the French position, because the French position typically gets quite aggressive quite quickly on any subjects, whether you're talking about drinking water standard or nuking Russia. I mean, to be honest, they're going to have the same reaction regardless of what France decides. I think what's really happening is in the council, it's going to be a play between those who are anti-Trump or pro-European and those whose capital is really, really, really linked to saying, oh, we're very close to Trump, we have Trump's favor, etc., etc. And in
So
the
Meloni
middle,
and Merz, in other words.
Meloni and Merz, and also to some extent Tusk, who is being strong against Trump, but also really wants to try to head off any problems from PIS. And
Right,
also,
because Tusk's problem is, of course, he personally dislikes Trump very much and has been fairly vocal, but he's the leader of an extremely Atlanticist country.
exactly. And this really interesting dynamic where it's not so much, I mean, let's face it, France is going to do what it wants on this topic, because France is the only member state that really has a full spectrum navy that can actively send, 12 frigates, 2 helicopter carriers, and a nuclear armed aircraft carrier to the Mediterranean. So what we've done already, or what Macron's already ordered to the military now, is basically what we can do at any time if we want to go and deal with the Hormuz Strait. The problem is that it's not our problem. And I think that this is going to be the decision at the council. You have Germany and Italy who will say we should support Trump in this because we need him to back us up. Maybe we can convince him to help Ukraine a bit more. They won't. Maybe we can convince him to be nicer to us and remove tariffs. He won't. Maybe he'll become a better person. He won't. The reality is that they're going to keep trying to sell things to Trump or keep giving him wins. What all that's going to do is hamper them at home. I mean, Meloni needs some distractions from her constitutional revision, which is a mess right now. Merz is just trying to survive at this stage because his popularity is cratering. And actually, funnily enough, speaking about the polling of European leaders, who the leaders who are doing the best out of the situation are arguably Sanchez in Spain and Macron. But at this stage, again, Sanchez is unkillable.
In Denmark.
And Frederiksen. But Sanchez is unkillable. This guy is like Mark Rutte on steroids. Like nothing sticks. It's absolutely outstanding. And Macron doesn't care anymore. He's legacy shopping, he's doing what he can, and he doesn't need to operate within the council anymore. Because at this stage, what? He's got maybe until the end of this year to actually really be able to do anything.
Hmm.
And he'll do that, and that's it.
Well, as you say, the only European militaries that can really make a difference here are the British and the French militaries. The British are leaving their options open for the moment, but it doesn't sound like they're going to send ships unless something changes. The French have said no, but you never know with Macron. I'm still not convinced that they won't. With Germany and Italy, it would be more of a, let's say, a symbolic participation. However, that symbolic participation could very easily drag them into the war. And I think they know that, actually. What's interesting is I've seen from the German and Italian governments, they're not doing their usual do whatever Trump commands type thing. In fact, just a couple hours ago, the German Defense Minister Pistorius gave a press conference really lambasting the Trump demand that Germany send ships, saying this is America and Israel's war, and there's no reason why we should be joining it because it would risk dragging Germany in. I do think they can see now that Chancellor Merz and Prime Minister Maloney's embrace of this war early on, not getting involved in it, but morally defending it, refusing to point out that it's a violation of international law. Chancellor Merz saying endorsing the goal of regime change along with President von der Leyen. They're now realizing that was a mistake and that's going to be a really big liability going forward because there's clearly no plan in place here. The war is going to go on. I think Donald Trump has lost control of the ability to even stop this war at this point. And they realize what a disaster this is, and they're starting to realize the political implications of their early endorsement. So I think that's going to make it very unlikely in the next days that any European country agrees to send ships. Unless it has absolutely no relevance. I think Azerbaijan agreed to send ships, but they're on the Caspian Sea, not the Persian Gulf. I don't even, the ships literally can't.
Watch out, Iran. Come on, guys.
Yeah. I mean, well, Iran's already bombing them, so that doesn't really help them out much, but I guess if they figure they're already getting bombed, I don't know. But I can't see a scenario in which the European countries agree to do this because there's so little in it for them. That being said, and I just published a Substack about this on Monday, that we're hearing this argument that the Europeans should think about taking Trump up on this request because he is so vulnerable right now, but asking for something in return, namely that he drops the tariffs against the EU and that he restarts the support for Ukraine that he ended last year. I'm not sure I see Trump agreeing to that, or even if he did agree to that, there's no guarantee that he sticks to his word. So I'm not sure how wise that is. What do you think? Do you think is this an opportunity for the Europeans to take advantage of Trump's weakness and make him go back on some of those threats, or is that a really stupid thing to even be considering?
I think it's catastrophically stupid. I think if it was an actual, I'm going to be a bit harsh here. If we were dealing with an actual human being at this stage, who had all of his cognitive facilities and who wasn't effectively being used as a sock puppet by some of the worst people that America has produced in its very, very short history, then sure, there's a way that we could bargain this into like some wider deals, some support and some alleviation of pain for the European semiconductor industry and critical raw materials and the automotive industry, whatever. The reality is that what could happen, best case scenario in my head, is the Europeans make that deal. Trump says, yeah, sure, why not? The Europeans get stuck in another quagmire in the Middle East because of a fucking American. And then what happens is 3 days later, after the thing is ended, Trump goes, oh, by the way, haha, sorry, tariffs.
Tariffs are back. Yeah.
Exactly. And this is exactly what they'll do. I mean, I don't know if you saw the interview being done by Caroline Levitt this afternoon, or Stephen Miller said something this morning as well. They basically were asked, why should the Europeans do this? Why should the Europeans help you after you threatened to invade Greenland to the point that they stationed soldiers there? The fact that France had to send its nuclear submarines to go back up Canada when you threatened to invade them. You've put tariffs on the Europeans over and over and over again. You've basically created the European chances of a GDP growth this year because you fucked oil for everybody. And gas prices are about to go through the roof. And then on top of that, you're giving money back to Russia by alleviating sanctions. You've sold Ukraine up a river with not even a boat. They're just drowning. It's horrible. And then you expect Europeans to go send their people to go die in a river in the Middle East. And the response was, oh, but they owe it to us because we got rid of the Ayatollah.
Right.
And we're solving their problems for
And
them.
they owe it to us because we gave money to Ukraine before. But by that, they mean Joe Biden gave money
Yeah.
to Ukraine, gave support to Ukraine, which they have now ended, eliminating any leverage. So they're not
Yeah.
actually offering to restart that support for Ukraine. But they're still saying that they deserve support for helping Ukraine, even though they didn't help Ukraine. They're saying the U.S. in general deserves like recompense for that aid that Joe Biden gave. But you're right; it doesn't make any sense. I actually wrote this Substack on my flight from Barcelona back to Brussels. And I started the flight writing, yeah, maybe this is an interesting idea to take advantage of Trump's weakness. And by the
And
end
then
of
you
the
thought
flight, when
about
I
it.
finished the piece, yeah, anyone reading this piece can see I go on kind of a mental journey. And by the end, I'm like, this is the stupidest idea I've ever heard of. Because you're right. First of all, how could you trust Trump on anything of
You
his word?
can't.
But also, the risks for getting involved in this war are so enormous that it would outweigh any type of short-term benefit in getting rid of tariffs, in getting U.S. support for Ukraine, in just
Yeah.
unblocking the strait. I mean, in any event, it would take weeks to send these ships over to the strait. And then they get there, and then what? There is no plan for how to do this. There aren't enough ships in the entire navies of all the U.S. and Europe in order to escort every commercial vessel through the strait. So it's not even clear what he's asking. But then also, you're handing Trump and Netanyahu a huge victory here by
For
getting
no
involved in
reason.
the war. This is exactly what they want. And actually, you risk expanding and prolonging the war by doing this rather than resolving the situation, because the most likely thing to end the war right now is Trump getting spooked by the economic damage being caused by this closure of the Strait of Hormuz. He realizes that he doesn't have the political capital to do the land invasion that could end that. And so he declares a fake victory and walks away. If the Europeans
Yeah.
tell him, okay, we're sending ships and they'll be there soon, they'll be there in a minimum a week or 2 weeks, then he's going to wait it out. Then we're actually prolonging the war by the Europeans saying that they're going to send the ship. So actually, I think that any talk of like trying to get concessions from Trump in exchange for agreeing to bail him out here, there's just no positive outcome on
Yeah.
that. For Europe, there are only negatives.
And there's also one big thing about the situation, that the reality of the Strait of Hormuz crisis is that this isn't coming about because of the current action in Iran. This is coming about because of the ongoing Yemen civil war, the way the Houthis are running around launching missiles at everything that moves through the funding they're receiving from Iran. So in reality, if you really think about it, if you go through the process and you go all the way down from top to bottom on how to solve the current crisis with that, you end up with a forever war in Yemen and a forever war in Iran that will make Iraq look like play school.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we
I
don't
mean,
want that.
yeah. So this idea of expanding that Red Sea operation over to the Gulf, I guess, was discussed today by the foreign ministers, but the
Yeah.
Germans shot it down really fast. They're like,
Yeah.
nope, that mission is for the Red Sea, for the Houthis. It geographically does not extend to the Persian Gulf. And in terms of rules of engagement, it does not extend to
No.
escorting ships through the Strait of Hormuz. It's a totally different operation. Now, I wonder if that idea might be revisited at the Council Summit on Thursday, but it just seems to me that all signals are the Europeans are not going to go for this in any way. And so assuming that holds, what's next? I mean, it's incredible to see Trump really backed into a corner here.
Yeah.
This is really the most vulnerable he has ever been, actually.
Yeah.
Let's say, except for January 6th. So this is really his lowest moment politically. This is a disaster. You see how his vice president and secretary of state have kind of disappeared over the past week. It's only Pete Hegseth out there, the secretary of war, defending this operation anymore. What's scary is Trump is going to get more and more erratic, and Hegseth is going to get more and more erratic over the coming days as the reality of this clusterfuck really, really hits home. But it's anyone's guess what's going to happen here. I mean, anything could happen. Trump could declare war tomorrow. The effects of this, of course, will not be over if he says it's over, but at least maybe that gets the strait opened up fairly soon. But or he could just dig in completely and launch a nuclear weapon at Iran. We don't know. That's the really
Yeah.
scary thing about the moment that we're living in. How do you think French people are feeling about France's place in this crisis? Because obviously Europe as a whole is just an observer right now, a totally powerless observer. Do you think there's an
Yeah.
appetite for France getting involved? I mean, what was the reaction to France sending the warships over to Cyprus to protect Cyprus, along with the UK, Spain, and Italy, who also sent ships? Are people nervous about that?
No, they're not so much nervous. I mean, the polling in general is telling us that people don't want any business with Trump's suicidal wars. I mean, I think as a nation, we can agree on one thing is that we should give Trump and Hegseth guns and let them go play action man in the Middle East. I mean, to be honest,
Mm.
not us, monkeys, not a circus. But I think what the French people are actually supporting in general is that one, Iran's a bad idea. Two, we need to actually back up our allies when they're being bombed for something they've had nothing to do with. I mean, look at it this way. You've got Cyprus being bombed by Iran because Iran's decided to just scorch the earth. I spoke about this with Annalise Rees a few weeks back about the absolute mess
Yeah, I
that
saw
was
that.
unfolding. And
Yeah.
on top of this, you've got Iran bombarding French bases in Iraq and in Syria, which are actually part of the anti-Islamist actions. Because what Iran's doing is they're trying to apply as much pressure to everybody in the region, trying to cause as much damage as they can. And also, in my opinion, I think this is probably shared by some people, they're treating any action now against Iranian proxies throughout this entire situation as an attack on themselves. They're also using it as a free hit on certain actors who have been giving them headaches for the last few months. But what's really, really, really interesting is that I think across Europe, aside from these weird far-right losers who are getting absolutely bodied by Louis Theroux on Netflix right now, no one has any interest in Europe in touching this crisis with a 10-foot pole.
Nobody. You're right. Yeah.
We'll protect our people. We'll protect our area. Like, I mean, sure, you may see, I don't know, EU Atalanta continuing in some way, shape, or form. You've got the Red Sea mission. You've got these various packages happening and continuing the operations. Aside from that, this isn't our problem. We've got a big issue to our east, which is called Russia. We need to be backing up Ukraine, who, thanks to the support that it's still getting from Europeans, is running roughshod across the Russian front line and recapturing massive regions right now. We don't need to be
It's
getting involved in this mess, you know?
Natalie Tochi had an interesting, very good column in The Guardian on Monday morning, saying that essentially people always like to talk about whenever there's a crisis, they say European divisions are preventing a solution. And she said, actually, that's not really the case this time.
No.
She said that was the case back in 2003 with the Iraq War, where Europe was torn apart by whether they supported it or whether they didn't support it. In this case, everyone opposes it. The question is, who's willing to criticize it? That's a division. But also, who might get sucked into it by accident? So there is no country that wants to join this war. It's notable to point out, though, that no one was asked, right? The difference with the
Yeah,
2003
of
Iraq
course.
War is that the U.S. built the coalition of the willing. George W. Bush did that. Donald Trump did not do that this time. So, one imagines that some of these Eastern EU countries, if they had been approached by Trump in the run-up to the war and say, hey, would you join this coalition of the willing to go to war with Iran? They probably would have said yes. But the thing is, they weren't asked. And now that it's such a disaster, of course, they're not going to
Yeah.
join. So right now, we really, because it's Trump loves to extort the Europeans out of intimidation. And to be fair, George W. Bush did the same exact thing in 2003 in getting half of the current EU members to join the war in Iraq. But Trump didn't use that power this time, although he could have. And now it's too late, right? Because
Yeah.
now it's such a disaster, no one would join. But the issue is, are European countries going to accidentally get dragged into this, even though no one in Europe wants to touch this with a 10-foot pole? And you mentioned
Yeah.
those bases in Iraq, the French bases that are getting attacked. The risk is Iran really seems intent on trying to draw the Europeans into this war and also trying to drag the Gulf countries into this war. To what extent do you think France just has to allow some of its bases to be attacked without retaliating, because the risks of France overprotecting these bases is that it then gets pulled into the war. I mean, some of these bases might just have to be abandoned for the moment, right?
I mean, they won't be abandoned because I think most soldiers and most of the military staff understand that if you're on a military base, you're at risk. I've got friends in the military, they deal with this stuff on an almost weekly basis, to be honest. I mean, I think this is why, and I think, to be honest, what I can see happening is that we'll get the strongly worded letter, we'll get the nonsense about how, Europe disagrees, signed Ursula von der Leyen. That will probably be the European response. What we'll see on the back end, however, is you'll see France continuing to do all of its back channeling, all of its diplomatic efforts across the region, because arguably the member state with the strongest presence and the strongest relationships in the Middle East is France right now. And so what we'll likely see is we'll see the French continuing to engage in diplomacy to try to wind this back and stop this. The problem is, and this is what I can imagine is being said by the Iranian regime right now, is that they will tell the Europeans, no matter what, this doesn't end until the Americans and the Israelis stop.
Yeah.
And the problem is that there's no brakes on the strain because the Israelis have wanted this for decades. The American far right and the American right and the Republicans in general have wanted this for decades. And on top of this, let's face it, this is another distraction from Donald Trump's problem in the US. So first you had the Venezuela situation, which achieved nothing aside from kidnapping one guy and promoting his assistant. You have now the Iranian situation. And
Cheered
now
by the EU, cheered by Europe's conservative
by the
leaders,
EU.
we should point out.
And on top of this, they're already talking about going after Cuba. And at this stage, I don't think they care about how they do it. I think they're running away from either the poor economy in the US, the jobs collapsing across the American continent, the Epstein file mess, which is continuing to be a thorn in Trump's side, and the fact that Donald Trump is going to ensure that the Republicans are going to get absolutely wasted in the midterms. And so,
If
to be
there
honest,
are free and fair midterms, we'll
if
see
there are
about
free
that.
and fair midterms. But the situation now is that there are no brakes on this train. They're going to keep going. And I think, honestly, the most positive outcome of this, I think, is Trump gets bored, runs his little dementia-riddled body over to another corner of the world, starts bombing that country, and then leaves Iran alone. And Iran quietly licks its wounds and then starts going back to what he was doing before. Because
Yeah.
I don't see a diplomatic solution to this situation because Trump's not going to give in. The Ayatollah is the least diplomatic person on the planet. And let's face it, we're going to be in a defensive posture for a while because we're going to be the ones targeted by all these extremist lunatics who want revenge on America.
Well, what we're hearing so far when we're talking to the national offices here in Brussels ahead of the summit on Thursday is that there's going to be a big debate about whether or not the council conclusions say that there was a violation of international law. Here, Pedro Sanchez is pushing for that to be in the conclusions, and of course, the Germans are fiercely resisting that, and that is shaping up to be the big battle on Thursday. You know, on one hand, it obviously doesn't matter, right? It's happened, but it kind of does matter also because, as you say, there's these potential next conflicts. And if the EU doesn't signal now that, okay, enough is enough, we looked the other way with Venezuela, we looked the other way with the first Iran bombing, but now we oppose this for whatever that's worth. And even if the EU can't do anything to stop the US invading Cuba, for instance, we're going on record now that enough is enough, we oppose this, and there's going to be diplomatic consequences. Do you think it's important to have that language in the council conclusions on Thursday, explicitly saying that this was a violation of international law?
Yeah, of course, and you have to because look, let's face it. I'm not saying this because I'm an former IR student, and I studied these, and I just want my degree to continue to be relevant. But if we don't have a rule-based system to ensure that we're all operating the same way, that we're all following the same sort of moral guidance, that we're not just randomly shooting each other over and over again, all we end up doing is we end up normalizing a world where Trump can go around assassinating and kidnapping leaders, Israel can continue bombing whoever it wants, Russia can invade whoever it wants, and we can just all shoot each other with impunity. I mean, look, I know that the UN is a joke and it's a completely useless mess, but I mean, let's face it, it is still one of the only institutions that really makes some sort of effort to try to keep the world spinning in a positive way.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to note, actually, that we've kind of gone from what was in Merkel's era, this kind of moral backbone in the EU, where we were always about the international law and respecting democracy and respecting sovereignty of all these states, right? And where it was always the periphery countries that were always considered a bit like loose cannons. France always wanted to go commit war crimes in whatever country, blah, blah, blah. We've now gotten to a stage where in the EU, the moral leadership is being held by France, Spain, Poland, Greece, and let's say Romania and some of the Scandinavian countries that aren't too close to Trump, right? And we have a very real problem where a lot of member states are starting to give up on a very fundamental aspect of the European Union. And we're seeing this echoed by the German European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, that maybe international law isn't so important.
Right.
Maybe,
The speech she gave last week to the
yeah.
ambassadors saying basically international law, let's forget about it.
Yeah, and it's ridiculous because I think there's a juvenile opinion spinning around in the member states' capitals, or some of them anyway, and at the European level and internationally, is that, and to be honest, this is making me think a bit too much about Mearsheimer for my liking, but people seem to be going to this place where you can't have strong security systems and strong militaries without also respecting international law, which is absolute nonsense, because the reality is that you really, 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 really need to ensure that international law is being respected, because otherwise you can't go criticizing or employing sanctions or what have you against a country that, is murdering children or engaging in genocide or engaging in some form of mass rape, as we've seen in several countries in the last 30 years. We physically would not be able to actually react to a lot of these events and a lot of these very horrible crises that we really need to be able to respond to if we're not defending international law, if we're not defending sovereignty of states, if we're not defending the right to people to live freely without being bombed to death. And I think a
Yeah, I
lot
mean,
of these countries are being silly, to be honest.
yeah, the argument that let's be honest here, von der Leyen, I'm increasingly convinced she has no ideas of her own. She just
Yeah, of
people tell her
course.
what to say, and she says it. And in this case, Friedrich Merz is telling her what to say, and Friedrich Merz is
And
basically
Weber.
telling us, okay, international law, maybe this violated it, maybe it didn't. It doesn't matter because it's happening. This is all a useless discussion. But it's not a useless discussion, as you say, because if the EU says to the US, okay, international law is over, do whatever you want, then they're going to do whatever they want. And maybe they'll do whatever
No.
they want either way. But the EU is becoming complicit in these actions by de facto endorsing them immediately after they happen. And Friedrich Merz is really dragging all of us in Europe down into an ethical and moral morass here.
Mm.
And he really needs to be vocally opposed. I would like to see Antonio Costa be more vocal. Okay, this year and a half of kumbaya relationship between the two EU presidents. Everyone was like, phew, because the relationship between the
Yeah.
previous European Council president, Charles Michel, and von der Leyen was so bad. By the way, I think all of us are having a little sympathy with Charles Michel these days. Not that I'm not sure he deserves it, but I mean, this woman is not easy to deal with. And I would like to, Costa came the day after von der Leyen gave that speech, casting aside international law. He gave a speech really rebuking her, not by name, but by
Yeah.
saying, no, actually, international law is important. I mean, he has to grab the reins here, and maybe part of this Sanchez wave. He is a Sanchez ally, and he is a center-left member of the Socialists and Democrats. Somebody's got step in here and say this is depravity. What Europeans are being
Yeah.
dragged into here by Merz and Maloney, who have been unquestioningly the most powerful people in the EU Council over the past year. I think really European media also needs to be picking up on this, and German media really needs to be holding Friedrich Merz to account. I've been horrified by the German media coverage of this war, of Venezuela, of Greenland. It's German media just they never cease to disgust me sometimes with their
Yeah.
acceptance of things that are so immoral, and yet they're so self-righteous at the same time. Drives me crazy. Anyway,
Yeah.
let's wrap it up there. But just a quick word for the European Council on Thursday, what do you think would be the results? Let's not go like, the dream results. Let's keep it grounded in reality. What would be a result from that council that you would think, okay, we're on the right track here? What would be your most realistic hope for Thursday's summit?
So honestly, what we're going to have to really see from the council is they need to come out of a minimum of communique, which is probably all we're going to get, restating that we're not getting involved in this mess. We'll defend European bases and European spaces in general from any attacks from anybody, particularly around this stage. But that rule of law is important. You can't get rid of international law and you can't keep behaving like this. They need to publicly rebuke Trump. The problem is that the pro-Trump faction, which is Merz, Meloni, uh, von der Leyen, aren't going to let that happen, basically.
And Orban and Fico
And
as well.
Orban, and yeah, exactly. But Orban, hopefully, he's gone in 2 months anyway. So really,
Yeah, let's see. That's a whole other topic there.
yeah.
Cool. Well, we'll see what happens on Thursday. But thanks, Julian, so much for joining me for this
Thank
video.
you.
Hope you guys enjoyed it, and stay tuned for coverage on both of our Substacks, Gulfstream Blues and the French Dispatch, for coverage of what happens next. Take care.
Take care, guys.